resources as the reservoir provides clean drinking water, which is, of course, now at risk.
Began disappearing at a speed that engineers could measure from space. Within hours, the Dnipro River was no longer being held back in the way it had been for decades, and downstream communities were facing a flood moving through homes, streets, and farmland. Russian authorities in the occupied part of Kherson later reported 41 civilian deaths from the flooding. Other investigations found evidence suggesting the true toll may have been considerably higher. Experts, investigators, and governments disagreed over exactly how the dam was destroyed and who was responsible. This is the Kakhovka Dam. And the problem isn't just what happened to the concrete. It's what happened to the truth afterward. The Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant was not originally a Russian project in the modern sense. It was built during the Soviet era, as part of an enormous national program to reshape the Dnipro River into a chain of reservoirs and hydroelectric stations. Construction began in 1951, and the plant was commissioned in 1954. The project was operated by the Soviet state, long before the Soviet Union disappeared and Ukraine became independent in 1991. The purpose was straightforward on paper: generate electricity, control water, support agriculture, create a massive reservoir that could supply cities and industries across southern Ukraine. The client was the Soviet government, while the project involved Soviet engineering and construction organizations rather than a single modern architectural firm in the way a skyscraper might. And the ambition was enormous. The Kakhovka Reservoir stretched for hundreds of kilometers along the Dnipro, becoming one of the largest artificial lakes in Europe. The hydroelectric station formed part of the famous Dnipro Cascade, a sequence of major dams that turned a naturally flowing river into a controlled system of energy production and water management. This wasn't built to impress tourists. It was built to make a river obey. For decades, the system worked. The reservoir supplied water for agriculture and industry. It supported communities. It helped regulate the river. The hydroelectric plant produced electricity. The structure itself became part of the landscape. Concrete, steel, water. A machine so large that most people living downstream never needed to think about the engineering behind it. And then the engineers started doing the math. The Kakhovka Dam was a hydraulic structure holding back an enormous volume of water, and the difference between normal operation and disaster could be measured in meters of water level, the condition of individual gates, and the integrity of structures designed to control a river with extraordinary force. In a normal dam, water pressure is resisted by the structure and transferred into the foundation and surrounding ground. The dam is designed around that relationship. The moment a major section of the water control system is deliberately or accidentally destroyed, everything changes. The technical term is hydraulic head, meaning the pressure created by the difference in water elevation between the reservoir and the river downstream. More height means more potential energy. And when the barrier controlling that energy is breached, the water doesn't negotiate. It moves. But here's something about this building that nobody ever explains. The Kakhovka Dam wasn't simply a wall sitting in a river. It was part of a complete hydraulic system. The dam, spillway structures, hydroelectric station, gates, channels, reservoir, and downstream river all interacted with one another. Change one part, and the consequences spread through the entire system. On June 6, 2023, that system was catastrophically disrupted. The exact cause remains politically and technically disputed. Ukraine said Russian forces occupying the dam had destroyed it from inside. Russia blamed Ukraine. International investigators and news organizations examined satellite imagery, eyewitness accounts, seismic data, and the physical evidence that survived. The Associated Press later reported that evidence pointed toward an explosion from inside the dam, while also documenting the enormous humanitarian consequences and disputes surrounding the reported death toll. That distinction matters. Because there is a difference between knowing that a structure was destroyed and knowing exactly who caused it. And there is another difference between knowing that a dam failed and knowing exactly how every part of the failure unfolded. Those are not the same thing. Let's talk about what happens structurally when you suddenly remove the barrier holding back a reservoir of this scale. The first effect is obvious. Water accelerates downstream. But the second effect is less obvious. The reservoir itself begins to fall. The Kakhovka reservoir contained an enormous volume of water, and its rapid drainage affected water supplies across southern Ukraine. The consequences extended far beyond the immediate flood zone. Drinking water systems were disrupted. Agriculture was affected. Industrial facilities lost access to the reservoir. The ecological consequences spread through wetlands and river habitats. And the destruction also created a completely different problem. The water that had once been behind the dam was now moving downstream. In occupied areas of Kherson, floodwaters entered settlements. People climbed onto roofs. Others waited for evacuation. Some residents were trapped in areas where the water rose faster than they could leave. Within hours, rescue operations were underway. Within the following days, the disaster became a political argument as well as a humanitarian one. And that part barely gets mentioned in the architecture magazines. The people affected weren't standing beside a giant engineering diagram. They were standing in bedrooms with water rising through the floors. They were moving furniture upstairs. They were carrying documents in plastic bags. They were watching refrigerators, doors, and pieces of household furniture float through streets that had been dry the day before. But here's the detail nobody surfaces. A dam disaster doesn't end when the water goes down. The physical consequences continue. Agricultural land can be contaminated. Water infrastructure can stop functioning. Reservoir ecosystems can collapse or transform. And when a reservoir drains, the exposed ground itself becomes a new landscape, covered in sediment and debris that had been underwater for decades. For people who lived around Kakhovka, the reservoir wasn't an abstract number on a map. It was part of daily life. It was water for farms. It was infrastructure. It was geography. Then it was gone. On the morning of June 6, the situation developed rapidly. Reports emerged that the dam had been destroyed. Water began rushing downstream. Flooding spread through communities in the Kherson region. Within hours, evacuations were taking place. Within the following days, thousands of people had been evacuated or rescued according to Russian authorities, while the humanitarian response was complicated by the ongoing war and the fact that different sections of the affected territory were controlled by opposing sides. Russian officials later said 41 civilians had died in the flooding in the Russian-controlled part of Kherson. But that number became part of another controversy. An Associated Press investigation concluded that the actual number of deaths in some of the hardest-hit areas could have been much higher than Russian authorities reported, particularly around Oleshki. So even the number attached to the tragedy became contested. 41. More than 41. Possibly hundreds. The historical record is still shaped by the fact that the disaster occurred during an active war. That makes the Kakhovka case different from a conventional dam failure. Here is the fundamental difference between Kakhovka and every other dam disaster we've covered. This wasn't simply a structure that failed under the weight of water. It became a battlefield. Compare it with the 2009 accident at Russia's Sayano-Shushenskaya hydroelectric power station. There, 75 people died after a catastrophic mechanical failure involving turbine unit 2. Investigators attributed the accident primarily to vibration and fatigue damage affecting the turbine mounting system. The structure survived. The machinery failed. At the 2019 Bratskaria mining dam disaster in Russia's Krasnoyarsk region, 6 people were killed when a tailings dam at a gold mining operation collapsed and flooded temporary workers' dormitories. Different structure. Different mechanism. Different human consequences. Kakhovka belongs to another category. The dam wasn't simply aging. It was destroyed in the middle of a war. But here's the question that sits beneath all of this. What happens when a structure designed to last for generations is suddenly removed from the system it was built to control? The answer isn't just measured in concrete. It is measured in time. The Kakhovka Dam had been operating for almost 70 years when it was destroyed. That means generations had grown up with the reservoir as a permanent feature of their environment. The engineering problem had become a social assumption. The water would be there tomorrow. The dam would still be there tomorrow. The gates would still be there tomorrow. Then one day, they weren't. There is no historical data for what the Kakhovka Reservoir looks like after a sudden destruction of this kind, because the exact combination of this structure, this reservoir, and this wartime event has no precedent in modern Ukrainian history. It is the first. It is the only one. Engineers and environmental scientists will spend decades studying what happened next. They will examine sediment movement. They will study groundwater. They will measure changes in river channels. They will document the recovery or disappearance of wetlands. They will look at agricultural land. And they will try to understand how ecosystems respond when a massive artificial reservoir suddenly stops being a reservoir. The people reading those reports in 2050 or 2060 will have something today's investigators don't. Time. Time to see what remained. Time to see what recovered. Time to separate the temporary damage from the permanent change. That is what makes infrastructure so strange. The biggest consequences often arrive after the cameras leave. And the human story is still happening now. Someone living in southern Ukraine is still dealing with the consequences. Someone who once looked across the reservoir every morning now looks at exposed land. Someone who depended on the water for farming has to make different calculations. Someone remembers the sound of floodwater moving through a street. A door floating against a fence. Mud drying into a hard brown crust on the floor. The smell of stagnant water trapped inside a house. These are not engineering measurements. But they're part of the engineering story. Because infrastructure exists to serve people. The Kakhovka Dam was built to control water and generate power. For decades, it did exactly that. The engineers who designed it could not have designed around every political event that would occur 70 years later. They could design concrete. They could design gates. They could design spillways. They could calculate pressure. But they couldn't design a structure that would remain untouched by history. None of them are thinking about the equations now. They're thinking about what comes next. Today, the Kakhovka Dam is remembered not simply as an enormous Soviet engineering project, but as the center of one of the most consequential infrastructure disasters of the modern war in Ukraine. The water is no longer behind it. The reservoir has changed. The communities downstream have changed. And the argument over exactly what happened continues. The structure is gone. The questions aren't. Drop it below. If you could book a room overlooking the Kakhovka Reservoir before the disaster, would you have? See you in the next one. Verify. Kakhovka Hydroelectric Power Plant, real Soviet-era hydroelectric facility on the Dnipro River. Kakhovka Reservoir, large artificial reservoir created by the dam. Construction began 1951. Hydroelectric